Looks like we're live. Welcome to the broadcast with Bradley J. and my special guest, Jim Sullivan, 26-year writer for the Boston Globe, right? 26 years, a music writer. Do I have it right?
That'll be it. 18
Wow.
on staff, 8 on freelance.
And he's had some wild and wonderful experiences with the coolest artists. That was his job. Hang out with artists, talk to artists, get to know them, tell their story, tell the story of the gig. And the result, 2 books, Backstage and Beyond Volume 1 and Volume 2, and we're going to cover Volume 2 this time. We've covered Volume 1. And first, you had parties for both of them, right? You had over at the Paradise.
We did. We had launch parties in July for the first one and October for the second one. Yeah.
That's fun stuff. And folks, if you're wondering who's included in this book, what artists, Jim just gave me the rundown of of some of them: Ramones, Sex Pistols, Public Image, Clash, Patti Smith, Buzzcocks, The Fall. So there's something in here for everyone. Joy Division. These are people that Jim talked to. He moved in these circles. Mission of Burma. Swans. That's like one of my desert island bands. Things change. Gang of Four, Cure, Pogues, which is poignant because of the loss of Shane. Police, Stiff Little Fingers. Imagine living the life of Jim Sullivan. Well, we're going to get a clearer picture of what that's like. Congratulations on Volume 2.
Thank you.
Now, you had such a rich experience, which continues, but up to this point, so many people, so many stories, you had to bust it into 2 books. And this was not by design, as I understand. It just turned out that, wow, your publisher pal said, dude, there's so much stuff here, we should do 2 books, right?
That's basically it. I just kept writing chapter after chapter, kept sending them in, and my editor-publisher is Ira Robbins, trouserpressbooks.com. And a longtime friend. I worked for him, did some writing for him back when Trouser Press was a magazine in the 80s. And he encouraged me to do these books. And yeah, there was no real thought as to length or who was going to be included, aside from a few obvious ones. And I just kept rolling and got on this big roll. And Ira realized when we were doing it, he said, these are good stories. However, you've got sort of a book stop here in terms of size. And that's when we said, all right, look, let's divide it up into 2 books. And roughly by era, first book would be artists who started in the 50s through the early 70s. Second book, pretty much the early mid-70s onward. And that's seen, as you can gather there, with the second book. I mean, that's mainly the punk, post-punk, new wave, etc., that generation. One you were quite familiar with, Bradley, as you hit BCN, I think you said in 81, correct?
81 and 82, I think it was right at the end of 81, 82, I think.
Yeah. So a lot of these do come from your era. And you and I, of course, crossed paths many times back in the day.
Yeah, I got to Boston in 79, worked at TGI Fridays, and right away started at ZBC. So I was here in the scene pretty early, but not as early as you, I guess, but
not by much. I mean, I got here in the fall of 78.
Okay.
So
1 year before I got here. And right away, man, Boston was a cool place. We would TGI Fridays on Newbury Street was cool. A bunch of interesting folks, a lot of college radio jocks, and we'd go out and see these bands of which you speak. I'm curious about the Cure first. Where did you? That didn't happen to be the event at the Underground, was it?
No, unfortunately, I missed the famous Underground gig. They were one of the many bands that later became quite famous. That played that tiny little L-shaped club on Comm Ave. And of course, it's kind of like the U2 gig at the Paradise. People like to say, yes, I was there. Well, if you were there, so were 800 other people in this place that fit about 75. So,
right. It's like the Sex Pistols' first gig, right? Oh, everyone was there. Like 900,000 people were there.
Actually, I was at the Sex Pistols' first gig, not in England, of course, but in the United States. It's kind of a funny story. I was on vacation visiting my mom in Florida, and then was planning on spending a week with a friend in Atlanta. And I flew into Atlanta. The Sex Pistols tour, scheduled to start elsewhere, had gotten delayed, visa problems, problems with the immigration system because of their criminal records, etc. And Malcolm McLaren bollocksing things up, their manager. And so, as it turned out, the U.S. debut was in Atlanta the day after I arrived. And what I did was just I went in line very early, bought tickets for $40 each, me and my friend, and stood in line. I think we were like third or fourth in line, and therefore we were, I think, like in the third or fourth row in the show itself.
Wow.
So yeah, we were there. And,
$40 each at the time was big money.
Big money. Well, it was funny because I think the price on the tickets I think might have been $450 or $550, something like that. And but for me, it was like, look, this is an experience. This is something I want to be at, both as a fan and as a writer. And I ended up filing a story. I was freelancing for the Bangor Daily News at the time, also, and I called my editor and said, I'm going to be there. Do you want a story? And she said, oh, yeah, absolutely. So in Bangor, Maine, we had a Sex Pistols story the day after.
So you, John is in the book. I'm interested about your interaction with him because he tends to be, gratuitously weird and difficult. Well, what was I'm sure he had fun with you as well.
Yeah, well, the first thing he said to me, and we didn't talk at the Atlanta show. That was I was just there viewing and writing, but we did talk at the first Public Image Limited show in Boston, the band after the Sex Pistols for him, and oddly enough, I was doing a freelance piece for USA Today at that time, and the first thing John said when I got into the dressing room was he said, "Don't worry, I don't bite." It's sort of like an interesting welcoming, and I've talked to him many times over the years, and yeah, I mean, he certainly can be prickly, but also, I mean, extremely engaging, witty, and has a deep history of music. Obviously, very strong opinions on things, and also very willing to entertain others' opinions and have a good friendly row. If you disagree, and I mean, I found myself. Over the years, I mean, I do agree with a lot of what he said, both in the books that he's written and in the interviews and some of in the songs. Not everything, but and especially, he's kind of leaned toward, shall we say, to the right recently. So I haven't really talked to him in the past couple of years about that. But certainly, over the years, I mean, he's a very engaging interview. And, there's a little bit of intimidation just because of who he is and what his personality is. But for me, it was pretty easy to get around or kind of relate to.
He must have had to deal with Malcolm McLaren. You must have come across him at one point.
I had a great sit-down interview with Malcolm at the Rat, upstairs at the Rat. And this was after the Pistols. I think it might have been 85 or so when he was doing one of his operas. And he was in town promoting it. And we had a great lunch. And it was, the Sex Pistols story according to Malcolm, which is slightly different than the one that Johnny and the rest of them tell, but about assemblage and putting together this team of misfits and, how Malcolm pulled the strings to get them where they were. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Both have some valid points. I think both sides probably exaggerated their own input into it. But he, too, I mean, he was very engaging. And I mean, one thing people used to say about Malcolm and John was that John was sort of like Malcolm's little brother. I mean, they had similar attitudes, different takes on things, but similar kind of attitudes and wit and acerbiveness about them. And Johnny hated that. I mean, he hated that people would bring that into the conversation or relationship. But I have to say, having met with both of them, dealt with both of them, not that far off. They were very similar in that way.
We're speaking with Jim Sullivan, who has a couple of cool books out. If you're from the Boston area and you went to a gig you loved anywhere, starting in early on, late 70s, if you went to that gig, chances are Jim was at the gig too. And you're probably saying, boy, I wish I took photos of this. I wish I had memories of it. Well, Jim was there, and even if there's no photograph, certainly he's painted a picture of the gig that you were probably at in these stories, and you really should go right to where you can get these books, probably Amazon or whatever's best for you, Jim. And
well, I could just say locally, as I'm in Brookline and you're in Brookline, the Brookline Booksmith, who hosted one of the readings that I did a few weeks ago, they've got it in stock. And
Good.
I know couple of other indies. Newbury Comics has it, and
That's cool.
Porter Square Books has it.
So when you're out getting gifts for other people, get this for yourself, or maybe you know somebody. This is the perfect gift. It's something that your gift recipient probably wouldn't think of getting, and they would go, "Oh my God, I was at that gig, I was at that gig, and that gig." Let's see who might be interesting to hear about. Well, we need to talk about Shane MacGowan of
Yeah.
the Pogues. I guess the president. He had high level people at his funeral and all.
He did.
But you you interacted with him. I never did. Tell me about him.
Well, he was often drunk, as we know. He was also very much a functioning alcoholic and a brilliant songwriter. Sometimes you would wonder about how those two fit together, because sometimes, excuse me, you talk to him and it'd be very slurry and you couldn't understand him. And part of that was because he didn't have a lot of teeth, and he slurred naturally, I think. Add the alcohol to it and it got a little worse, and then the accent. But he came up with this just an amazing bunch of songs. Those first two albums, Red Roses for Me, Rum Sodomy, and The Lash, which is brilliant. I've been listening to them both a lot since his death, and it really stands up. I saw them for the first time in London in 1985. The story is part of the book. And he came down. He was at the Pogues clubhouse, so to speak, Filthy McNasty's club there. And when he greeted me, I remember him coming down the stairs. He had a glass of whiskey in one hand and beer in the other one, and a big smile on his jack-o'-lantern face, teeth. And we began an interview. I saw them a few days later at a club called the Mean Fiddler. That was the first gig, and it was just amazing. The vibe was so intense and so warm. It was aggressive warmth, I guess is the way I'd call it. And here I was, a Yank in the middle of London with a bunch of English, Irish people, and fully accepted in the crowd. And I mean, I made friends for a night, as you sometimes do at shows, not always, but really did here. And it was a case of, can I buy you a beer? Can you buy me a beer? I mean, there was a real sort of, we're all in it together. And the Pogues were just fantastic. And it was, a light went off. I mean, it was, in my world, really one of the best things I'd seen since probably the Pistols or the Clash back in the day. It really relit a fire for me in terms of what this sort of different version of punk rock could be, albeit punk rock filtered through a Celtic point of view.
Sometimes you'd speak to people over the phone, but of course, a lot of times you'd go to the venue. Can you kind of give me an idea of what the day is like when you got to go to the venue? When do you speak to them? You go to the venue, the sound check. It might be difficult to find them. It's weird in a club in the day. It smells like stale beer and it's not very sexy with the lights on. And you have to find them. What's the experience like? Where do you usually chat with them, etc.?
Most of the in-person interviews I did at gigs were done post-show, i.e. in the dressing room. I tended not to want to bother anybody beforehand because there's a lot of prep going on, obviously, for the show. And if we set something up, that's what it would be set up for. And there were times where, things were less formal in those days. There weren't so many layers of passes to get through, or publicists, or security. And there were times where I could basically just kind of, knock on the dressing room door, ask to speak to the manager, explain who I was. Manager would say, "Hey, do you want to talk to?" And if that was the case, then sure, then I would be able to go in and do something with them.
So a lot of times it wasn't set up. You'd have to go and make this happen yourself.
It depended. I mean, as time went on, they tended to get very more formal and set up. And I mean, some of the interviews were done in hotel rooms ahead of time in other cities. They weren't all just done kind of on the fly backstage. And some, as you said, some were done on the phone ahead of time too. But in these books, I tended to write about people that I had relationships with that may have started as a phone interview, but also in the in-person exchanges that we also had. The Buzzcocks, very much like that. Pete Shelley and Steve Diggle became friends, and Pete is no longer with us. Steve is still a good friend. And, I spent a lot of time with them over the years. One of the best little memories of them was they had an opening slot on a Pearl Jam tour when Pearl Jam played Great Woods or whatever it was called in Tweeter Center, probably. And it was at the behest of Pearl Jam. They were big Buzzcocks fans. Now, the audience didn't care. The audience were there for Pearl Jam. The Buzzcocks were an old punk band from yesteryear as far as they were concerned, but not for me and not for Pearl Jam. And I remember being in the Buzzcocks dressing room this was ahead of the show, or after their show, before Pearl Jam show. And we were just sitting there shooting the shit and having a beer. And Eddie Vedder burst into the backstage area, and he was like a kid in a candy store, or just so excited to be talking to the Buzzcocks, being around the Buzzcocks, picking their brains for stories and anecdotes. And I mean, he was a fan. He was a big fan. And, I mean, they benefited from that exposure, from a very top band signaling them out as a band that they wanted to be with on tour.
Right.
And for me, it was very heartwarming to see Eddie just kind of not be a rock star at all and just turn into a fan that way.
So after these gigs, your job was to get the story. You might have been assigned to do it, but you really didn't know if you were going to be able to get backstage. It must have been kind of stressful. After the gig, you're going to have to, hopefully, the people that work at the place, they're going to give you access. Yeah, it's me, Jim. I'm going back there. Okay. Whereas a normal person wouldn't be able to. Then you got to knock on the door and see what kind of mood they're in. And so it must have been a little, always, if you're trying to do it that way, a little bit of uncertainty.
Yeah, there was at times. Like I said, I think more of these things were set up. I mean, than I think maybe you're suggesting here. I mean, there were certainly times where interviews happened that were sort of impromptu and that weren't scheduled, but most of the time they knew I was coming, and there was something. It wasn't quite as random as you're saying, I think.
So we're talking to Jim Sullivan about Backstage and Beyond, Volume 2, and to let you know some of the other artists that there are stories about. I want to run through this list again. The bottom of the list that I didn't get to before: Morrissey, Cars, Billy Bragg, Elvis Costello, Stiff Little Fingers, Police. We talked about the Pogues and a little bit about the Cure, Gang of Four. Here's a question. I talked to somebody who went to one of those festivals down in the Southwest, and it was a kind of a gothy, post-punky festival. Can't remember the name. They saw Gang of Four, said Gang of Four were horrible. And when I've seen them, they blew me away at the Paradise back in the original days, and one of the encore performances, like maybe in the 2000s. Do you tend to go to these reunions, and do you tend to be disappointed when you do? Like the Pistols or Public Image, they also did a kind of recent gig that I heard questionable things about. How do you feel about those comebacks?
Well, they're all varied. The first one, Gang of Four, I would say, I mean, I saw them a couple of years ago when they reformed after the guitarist Andy Gill died, and John King, the singer, came back into the band with Hugo Burnham, the drummer, Sarah Lee, the bass player, and David Paggio, new guitar player. And it was fabulous. Crystal Ballroom in Somerville. So that was just, A-level stuff. They played from mostly their first two records. Riveting stuff. The Pistols reunion tours, I've seen a couple of those, and they've been fun, kind of carnival-like in a way. Not with the ferocious intensity of when the songs were written, probably, but a good facsimile of it. Honestly, and they played better. They were better musicians. So in that sense, they weren't as sloppy. And then the songs they carried the day as they did back then. Right. They didn't have a lot of them, but they did.
So whoever told me that about Gang of Four must have been just wrong or not a fan. Or
I don't know.
Didn't get it or something. So I'll believe you over them. Patti Smith's got to be interesting to talk to. She's a cerebral person, and you can ask her a thoughtful question and get a thoughtful answer.
This was the main. I've interviewed her several times. The main interview that I key on in the book is I was in Detroit, and this was before she was, or just about launching her comeback record after being away for whatever it was, 8 or 9 years, and so she was just getting used to the interview process again. And I remember she came in. She was very shaken. She and her husband Fred, now no longer with us. had driven to the hotel, and they had gone through, I guess, the aftermath of this wreckage, this terrible accident. And so she was quite shaken to just kind of come in and having experienced that. So she had to kind of settle down and get into, reflective mode, which she did. And, we talked a lot about her early punk days. We talked about where she was now as a wife and a mother, and someone who was maybe not as angry as she was perhaps back in the day, and someone who was much more hopeful and optimistic about life itself. And that was when the song People Had the Power came out. And I thought the song itself was maybe a bit overly naive. And we talked about that, and she defended it, and rightfully so, to say that, this was something she really believed. She really believed in the connective value that people had, and the effect they could have on the world. And as expressed in that song, a real optimism. And, it was a great point for her, I think, just kind of re-entering the field that she had left after quite a long time. And,
So this interview, of course, is for everyone who sees it, but particularly Brookline, because Jim's a Brookline resident. I'm a Brookline resident.
yeah.
Brookline. Anybody in Brookline needs to trundle right on down to the bookstore. What is it? Is it Booksmith?
Booksmith, Brookline Booksmith, yeah.
Yeah. Brookline Booksmith in Coolidge Corner or wherever.
It is.
Get out,
Coolidge Corner.
get out, go for a walk, and this time when you go to the bookstore, you'll have a reason. You won't be just kind of browsing aimlessly. You say, I need to get that book. It's the real deal, and Jim's the real deal. Now, I have spoken to Mark Smith. Never did talk to anybody in Joy Division. I'm, pretty not flabbergasted, not surprised, but tell me about that.
Well, obviously, it wasn't Joy Division when I talked to them, because Joy Division ended when Ian Curtis hanged himself in May of 1980. I talked to them when they regrouped as New Order after that. However, a lot of the conversation over the years did go back to Joy Division, and the main source, I guess, for me would be Peter Hook, the bass player, to a lesser extent Bernard Sumner, the guitar player. And weaving their stories together for this chapter about what Joy Division was like, and the sadness and shock of Ian's suicide, and then the decision to continue on. And also sort of demystifying some of the things about Ian, and, saying that, no, he wasn't the depressive bloke that maybe had been painted in the press, especially after his death, and even after listening to the songs, which certainly have their fair amount of despair and in them. But they were talking about how he was a regular guy on tour, and he did his best to carry on and to kind of maybe bury some of the hard things that were inside of him, and to kind of be the cheerleader in the band, and take part in the pranks that the band played with each other, as young bands often do. And it was interesting because, this is a side of this guy that I didn't know that much about, and they were able to bring out in talking about him. And, talking about what would have happened had he lived, how would have the band that became New Order, what would that have been with Ian as the singer for the band? Would they have gone in that sort of synth direction that they did? And, Hookie thought, yeah, that they would have. I mean, they were kind of evolving that way anyway. Anyway, it's very fascinating. I mean, it's one of the things Hook said, and it's at the top of the chapter, is just about to be in, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't remember the exact quote, but to be in one band that changed the world or was so important is one thing, but to be in two bands that did that is really just quite amazing. And I don't disagree with that at all. Both bands had an incredible audience influence, and there's a reverence certainly for Joy Division. And New Order continues on, although Bernard has the name, and the other two people in the band, Julian and Stephen, and Hookie tours under his name, Peter Hook and the Light, which has his son in it, several other people. And Hookie, I think he's here back at the Paradise next September 2024. And what he does is different sets based on Joy Division and New Order songs, and he shifts them up every time he comes through. But he will generally do an album or two, and do these, very sets that really work. And his voice, strangely enough, maybe, is very much in the register that Ian Curtis sang in. So the Joy Division songs
Okay.
that he sings really sound good, and they sound proper, and they sound, close your eyes and you go, yeah, I think I might be at a Joy Division gig in 1978 or something.
So New Order was featured in that movie, 24 Hour Party People, right?
Yeah,
And was it the Hacienda?
yeah, yeah. That was
Oh,
the club they owned, so the New Order. Yeah.
wow. That's definitely, if you're a music person who likes the stuff we're talking about, is worth a watch. Now, was that in Manchester? Were they a
Yes.
Manchester? Okay,
Yeah.
imagine living in Manchester in, I don't know, 78, 79, 80, 81. The Fall, also from Manchester, right?
Yes.
Imagine going out. I mean, we thought we had a good scene in Boston. Imagine the scene in Manchester. I mean, if you look at a list of the bands from Manchester, it's not a giant town. And while it's very dreary by day, it must
Yes.
have been something to go out and have this palette of massively great bands to choose from.
I would concur. Definitely, Buzzcocks, of course, came from there too. Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Um, and the Fall is. You said you met with Mark at one point, Mark E. Smith, the Fall leader.
Yep, I'm going to take advantage of that opening to tell a very quick story over at
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
WMBR. My first radio thing in Boston was to answer phones for Peter Gates
Yeah.
at WMBR. He is a member of the Late Risers Club, which is still a show that goes on. And answering that was such a big deal for me. And go over to MIT. Wow, this is MIT. I'm in Boston, etc. And Mark Smith came through. Peter Gates interviewed him, and after we all went out for drinks at some downtown dive. But on the way, I said, "I'll show you where it is, Mark." And I went. We walked, and on the way, we went to Filene's basement together because he wanted to get a shirt. He wore those shiny disco weird shirts a lot. And I got some socks, and he said, "Oh, I'll get those socks." So Mark Smith bought me socks at Filene's basement. That's my Mark Smith story. I don't want to keep you forever, because I want to leave some more to learn from the book. Of the list of people that you gave me, what story that we haven't already covered would you like to tell?
Touch on the Ramones for a second. They started it all, and they're the first chapter in the book. Many interviews with them over the years. I'll single out one in particular that happened at the Orpheum with Dee Dee and Johnny, and this was before a show, actually, backstage, and it was very fun. I mean, they were in a good state, as you may or may not know. I mean, there were rival factions within the band, and Joey and Johnny particularly. But at this time, Dee Dee and Johnny were backstage, and it was a very fun interview because I was just kind of shooting quick questions at them, and they would be responding. I'd be asking about favorite TV shows, favorite comics. What about disco? Disco was big. It was starting to become big at the time, and they were going, God, disco. What hate that, or sounds like disco. And I said, so you've been to Studio 54? Oh, what's that? So there was this kind of really fun camaraderie banter going back and forth, and for whatever tension there might have been in that band, as we learned about later, they were at that moment, friends, and it was fun to be with, and just to kind of be part of that group for that moment in time. And
That's cool.
yeah,
It must be good to be such a master of your craft that when you go in to do these things, you're totally relaxed. You're not sweating it out, right? I mean, you remember when you were nervous, probably in the beginning. I got to do this. I can't screw it up. But now, and even then, for a large part of the time, you're good at what you do. You go in there, it must feel good. Everybody knows you. Hey, Jim, you get all kinds of respect. What a good life, right?
well, yeah, I mean, good life, certainly. I mean, I guess some people maybe knew who I was and had a relationship with me, others not. First time meeting, and I mean, that's, I guess, the trick of what I do, is try to get on the performer's wavelength, try to figure out where they're coming from, and try to match that. And even if some of the questions may be not controversial, but I mean, maybe a little bit prickly, I guess, you want to let them know that you're on their wavelength and that you're talking to them in a friendly manner, But as a journalist too, you're not just being palsy-walsy. I mean, there are things you want to get for the story. And there's at least a mental checklist that I have where I want to go. And then sometimes it goes off course. And when it goes off course, that can be even more fun when that happens. But the whole thing is trying to establish that trust. And if you do that, and I often was able to, that's where the great stories come from.
Lola Pope, she's up north in Maine now. She says being an arts reporter is wonderful. She worked as one for 25 years. Nothing better. Her beat was basically Portsmouth, New Hampshire,
Yeah.
Maine area. Yeah, I don't want to go too long, so let's quit here,
Okay.
folks. These 2 volumes they're so good. It should be top of your mind when you get out of the house. Go over to the Brookline
Here,
Booksmith.
I'll
and
flash
get
it on camera. This is the blue cover. This is book 2.
Burn it into their minds.
And book 1 is the red cover. So they're both Backstage and Beyond, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Classic rock and modern rock.
Right, and folks, the kids are into vinyl, and that means they like the tactile thing. It's they also like books too, actual books. Give them a book. Wow, this is just like a vinyl record. This is so real, man. One note on Joy Division, I didn't get in there.
Sure.
Joy Division at such an impact that you still see kids, 15, 16, 17, 18 wearing Joy Division T-shirts, and I give them a little nod, like, so they know that old guy, he knows, and I get them and they get me. It's kind of a little thing to see that shirt.
I love seeing that too, but the codicil to that, I think, Bradley, too, is that sometimes the kids buy it because of the art. It looks really cool, those jagged statue type things that are on there. And I know sometimes you'll talk to somebody who has a T-shirt and you figure that there's a real love of the band that you share, and sometimes you'll get a blank stare like, I don't know the music. So it's a statement, but it's a statement about something they don't really know about. That happens.
So do you tell them, if you're going to wear that shirt, you better go listen to this band?
I know. Well, let me sit you down, son. I'll tell you about that band.
Okay. Jim Sullivan, thank you so much, fellow Brookline resident. Folks, get out there and get this. It's really, really good. Jim's good at what he does. He has the stories. He knows how to tell them. He does tell them. In Backstage and Beyond, Volumes 1 and 2. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Bradley. Appreciate it. Always good.
And folks, also, don't just buy the book. Share this this broadcast with anybody you think that might like it. And if you're a person that's an administrator of your town website, or know that administrator, or want to put it up there, this is good, solid, non-controversial, non-political content that would be good on any town or major, group website, like the Facebook group Remembering BCN, or any rock-oriented Facebook groups. Go ahead and share it. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Bradley. Appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah.